Today is the first day. We have got in total 10 days of program. So it's going to be very intensive 10 days, especially for us and those of you who join us on some of the other days. Today we've got 3 presentations, and the first presentation is on actually Bengal famine. We covered Bengal famine before a couple of years ago, where Madhusri Mukherjee, who looked at Churchill's role in the role that Churchill played in making the famine what he became, so bad. Today we got Shanjukta Ghosh, and the title of her presentation is Changing Meanings of Rice, Famine, Food, Campaign and Cultural Response to Politics of Poverty, Bengal 1945 to 1959. Today's session, all the 3 sessions, will be chaired by Zainul Abedin. She is a PhD student.
Submitted.
Yeah.
Just recently submitted.
Oh, just submitted. So you can say a little bit about yourself and then take over for today.
Sure. Okay. Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming. My name is Zainul Abedin. I'll be chairing, as Ahmadullah said, the 3 sessions today. I am sort of a historian in training. I've just submitted my PhD on East Pakistan from 47 to 71. So this Shanjukta's talk is particularly pertinent for me and very interesting, actually. So I'm not going to talk much. I'm going to hand it over to Shanjukta, who has 45 minutes to an hour to deliver her talk, and then we'll have half an hour, I think, of question and answers, and my job is really to facilitate the discussion here. So, Shanjukta.
Thank you. I want to first say that this kind of topic that I've started working on is really a working topic still, and my long-term interest is to look at agricultural development, and I have studied that from 1870 till 1930 for my PhD, and my postdoc is really about looking at the whole war issue and how the question of food campaigns, which is kind of an under-researched area still, I would say. There's not really anybody who's worked extensively on why food campaign becomes as it is, and why it kind of shaped in that period. The focus will be really on the popular literature and the culture that I've done on this paper, and it kind of draws really upon the intellectual sort of fervor that started with Scott's publication of Rebellion and Subsistence in Southeast Asia, that focuses on the everyday life of the peasant and how the rural society is sort of shaped around that. And it also then looks at how the whole food question and food security is actually an obligatory role of the national elite to safeguard the grain producer in times of distress in the context of subsistence rights. The whole question of subsistence rights then brings us to looking at what exactly does subsistence mean in rural society, and the significance of rice, particularly in this subsistence relationship. So I'm going to look at the cultural sphere of subsistence rather than the economic sphere of subsistence, which is equally important. And the reason why I do that is I look at the economic activity of rice as intimately linked with the social and the religious duties that are embodied in Bengal's textual and oral traditions, and to look at the changing meanings of rice in the context of Bengal famine and the relief operations. It helps to look at the changes in the nature of subsistence mechanisms that are based on cultural expectations, and how the varying degrees of famine experience itself actually has an impact on certain legitimate claims of subsistence, and it moves from there into becoming a more value-laden agricultural commodity that has its own value in the political campaign of hunger. So I've kind of laid out the main points in this as the key elements of the paper, showing how I will then kind of conclude by looking at the implications of such cultural appropriations for poverty relief. So if you hold on to that screen, then I go into looking at what exactly was this famine about. It's a famine that has been hugely researched. It's an over-researched area. As you will all know, the main the works have been of Amartya Sen recently, who's obviously focused on the whole entitlement thesis. And I kind of want to just quickly run through a few important statistics here. That is, 1.5 to 3 million people have perished in every part of undivided Bengal. That obviously had far-reaching effects on the social side of things. But how do we look at this whole disaster, which is sort of in history? It is explained in different ways. It's a food availability decline story. It's a natural disaster. It's also what Amartya Sen has called is the breakdown of the legal entitlement of people. And the availability of cheap imported rice from neighboring areas like China and Burma, it actually didn't, it could have resolved the food supply to some extent, but what it did was it actually started to break down all the subsistence mechanisms that were in place in the village around that time. I've kind of, the entitlement thesis of Amartya Sen is quite a big thesis, and I've tried to draw two very important points from the entitlement thesis, which I've tried to link up with the implications of breaking down the socioeconomic relations with actually a moral crisis that I say that is Sonar Bangla, and all its image of prosperity and everything is also breaking down. As Sen puts it rightly, is the result of inequalities in the mechanisms of food distribution that raises the large societal and economic issues concerning capabilities, opportunities, and choice. And I want to focus on these particular areas that then relates to the whole issue of how it contributes to understanding human well-being and how it's articulated in the complexities of rice consumption. Now, rice actually represents the idea of well-being in Bengal. It is expressed not only in material terms, but also in terms of the symbols that govern sharing of food. Now, apart from fulfilling certain basic needs, rice meets the instrumental needs of placating gods, funerary rites, and is widely used in other rituals. It is therefore, as I say, it is really tied to the social grammar of Bengal. And my next slide kind of runs you through how I then look at the value of rice in society. As I said, it's really about the ability of a person to not just fulfill himself, but fulfill the needs of others. And in rural society, the whole production and the consumption of rice is very much tied to the religious duties, and it's also tied to certain ideas of what it means to actually store rice, to have a stock of rice. And when famine hits Bengal, how does that idea of what is the stock actually dismantles in many ways? So I bring the concept of bhandar or storage over here, and I look at these ideas are kind of tied to certain indigenous values that people have actually attributed to various categories of rice. I want to also mention here that when one of the intellectual reasons of actually going into this paper is when I bumped into hundreds and hundreds of varieties of rice and their names, and not their botanical classifications, but their economic classifications. And I tried to look at what and how these various terms of commercial categories of rice were actually related to the way they are also part and parcel of how things are consumed, how things are distributed, and what meaning it has in the context of shortage. So I kind of then looked at, I don't want to go into the various details and the varieties of rice, which will probably come out when I actually publish the paper. But I want to say one thing is that there are also various preparations of rice, which also has various names, and it has value for domestic consumption as well as market commodities. And these revolve around processing rice into sweetmeats, cakes, and other preparations. So what I'm trying to say is there's a hierarchy of the value of rice in the way it is stored as well. So bhandar is not only a sign of abundance, as Paul Greenough has actually suggested in his book, in his famous book, Misery of Bengal, but I also think that it is stock, and during times of food shortage, it's included not just rice, but also the various substitutes and the byproducts to be shared among the members of the family. So I move to the next area that I want to quickly run through. What then could be the social value of what is called the bajarer chal, or the market rice. The bajarer chal, or the market rice, is evidently out of the peasant subsistence categories. But what is interesting is that the cropping decisions to actually market rice and the cropping decisions to actually consume rice, these are not always interlinked. So there's a huge range of intermediate interests in the rice trade, with varying proportions of share in the marketing of rice and its products. But beyond the domain of domestic consumption, subsistence-oriented peasants were actually willing to take advantage of the marketable rice, or the bajarer chal. And demand for the higher priced translucent rice was actually increasing in the market just before the famine. But what the value of the bajar's rice did, with its differing names and connected to the various localities where it was grown and where it was assembled and milled, was a growing social distinction that was kind of gradually creeping up with the range of intermediate economic interests that were kind of piling up around this time as well. So rice, the intermediate interest in the rice trade and the distinctions in the marketability of the rice invariably created a distance between the principal ryot, who is directly responsible for tilling his soil and reaping off the benefits and profits, now is actually coming from outside the village. It's actually being taken out of his hands of cropping decisions. So there is a sense of dislocation that kind of prevails within the local economy that often enraged villagers against the araddars. And they figure very prominently, as we will see in the later cultural literature, who actually brought the stocks through nominal cash advances, and they created a whole lot of distinctions in consumer choice between the urban elite and the riots. So we are still on slide 6, and you can while I'm talking, you can look at some of the summaries that are there for you to look at. So I'm trying to say that the transformation of rice from being an intimate commodity of subsistence within the hierarchies of the village and the household is now a remote, marketable commodity, meant that meanings of rice were actually construed outside the formal relations of dependence. And I want to really highlight this when and differ in many ways when Paul Greenough says that when people actually leave the village, they carry with them the idea of dependence and network and patrons and clients, and their whole hierarchical relations is kind of transported with them. But the argument is, no, they were actually not carrying all of it. They were probably carrying part of it with it in terms of social memory of leaving the village. But already we are seeing the breakups in the village, and various constructs are coming out here. So rice as the mainstay of the village economy was not only scarce, but its deprivation becomes a moral and a social decay, and the source of it is that. I'll move to the next slide where I look at, I kind of look at the deprivation of rice, and I talk here of the moral and the social decay that I've just picked. So if you want to quickly run through that point, then you've got it there. By the time the famine sets in, obviously Amartya Sen's analysis of the Bengal famine as a result of crisis and entitlement draws attention to the fate of the non-cultivating group at the heart of famine resilience, who suffer extreme deprivation, unable to either purchase food or exchange it for labor, and being overwhelmingly weak, the moral economy based on the mutual benevolence of what I call the Annadata, the patron, and the loyalty of the Pishya, that is the dependent, proved to be very inadequate in extreme cases of survival. I'll quickly run to slide 2, where you can have a look at how the value of rice was actually dramatically changing by the time we reached 1943, and you can look at the prices that have moved from 13 to 14 rupees per mond to 37 rupees, and that's a huge jump. And the source I've written at the bottom, which is also partly derived from Sen. And what happens around this time is also that there was a prevailing tendency to actually play down the real scarcity in Bengal for fear of public repercussion, as well as a lack of knowledge about the actual pattern of grain consumption. Rice, which ordinarily, if you can read it, I'm not sure if you can entirely, you can see that there's Wallace Rodel Ackroyd's statement there, and that was from his own book. And I have, I can expand on this by saying what the British Secretary of State for India, Amory, was giving speeches in the Parliament around that time, and most importantly, A.N. Stephens's harrowing coverage in the British Statesman actually was a very, very important vehicle of raising public opinion. But I want to really shift from here, that's a story that is quite known or well known, to an example of the discursive mediation that happens in the city that shifts from how the government surveys were actually categorizing the people who were coming into the city as the destitute. Now that is part of what Bernard Cohn has says is the language of command. That is the language of the bureaucracy, the language of administration, whereby people are categorized as beggars or as vendors or whatever. But the other side of the story is, how do you actually look at who are the starving ill? And that becomes an important term around this period of Statesman's campaign. So we actually look at the birth of what I call new urban species, who are migration and famine victims as a result of growing urban discrimination, that kind of looks at how they, and the description that goes on to circulating them is the other influential popular and emotive public images that were in circulation about the destitute who needed to be hurdled together from the city's pavement, whose rags smelt from a long distance, and whose children looked vacantly at the sky, being reduced to a subhuman stage. I wanted to just put together Pramendra Mitra's description, which kind of runs through the whole category of new urban species as grotesque caricatures of people who gather garbage in the streets, and looks at the dregs of rice, as you can see at the bottom, that rice is now just thrown around everywhere for people to be part of an organized violence against hunger and destitute migrants. So the other side of this development is really what I call, there's the growth of famine literature, and it represents the value, to me, the historical collection and personal recollection in an attempt to put together ingredients for a public memory of the great Bengal famine. And I bring a concept in called the Samadbadi consciousness, which has been described as a structure of beliefs and sensibilities in social welfare that was non-partisan in its fundamental approach, which means that a lot of them who were part of the political parties were actually dissociating from how they actually come to terms with this kind of an image and a problem of poverty. The famine-generated literati were able to communicate in their works various elements of extreme pessimism, decadence, mistrust, and irresponsibility of the looming human tragedy through images and text. And the historical process that is actually involved in assembling famine images and coding it for an audience required configuring the famine artifacts like the bowls of rice, half-eaten dead bodies, empty golas, and I will show you some pictures towards the end of the presentation so we don't have to keep moving between the texts. These were actually the cultural referents that were adapted by contentious urban constituencies to promote a social and a moral struggle against famine. Now, methodologically, I will use examples of these texts and art that represented famine as a transformative event in the lives of authors and their characters, shaping their relationships and personal values in both societal and familial settings. The temporal significance of famine texts, to which I will return right at the end of this talk, many of these were actually first-hand oral testimonies. They were personal memoirs, they were photographs, genres representing real theatres that cut across documentary and fictional narratives. And together, the value of historical collection, as I've written there, is to actually map this kind of a social memory of famine. I'm going to move to the next slide to look at what is actually the life of rice in this famine literature. And I argue that it is actually transforming from a symbol of rural prosperity into a famine food of last resort. I bring in the concept of survival over and over again, resembling the debris of vacuous life that was easily disposable. And I say that because rice actually acquired a substitutive nutritional value in lieu of its other manufactured byproducts when it was charitably served in the Bengal famine as fan. The starchy leftover water in which rice is cooked that is wasted and disposed by the well-to-do. Grinnell points out the distinction between relief strategies of 1943 and of those preceding famines, where the usual concern was to supply food grain among the hungry. Here, with 43, we find a newly concocted gruel that replaces grain, and the latter available only through control shops to the privileged classes. Hence, gruel could not be quantified, and demands over it could not be fixed, so that appropriate protests could be organized in times of shortage. Now, that partly explains why we don't see a massive amount of riots. That is very common sort of argument as about the fatalism of the Bengal peasantry around famine period. The usual picture we find is that of the plaintive cries who say, "Fan thou, go fan thou," echoing through the city's lanes. The starch drained after boiled rice was also all they would ask for. And they're moving from door to door in search of food, and all this emotion and disgust and empathy and vacant and repetitious acts that needed no direct attention. And although the disposable gruel actually satiated the hungry, it had neither any substantial nutritional value nor served as a symbolic gesture of charity. The serving of fan outside the house from relief counters or by the roadside was seen as a routine way of averting an encounter between the privileged urban dweller and the visually horrific distressed. The plaintive cries for fan from the destitute was, however, symptomatic of the inner contradictions of the administrative management of famine and the civil responses to degrading the material and the moral conditions of urban Calcutta. And I kind of look at the textual analysis of rice as an object of scarcity in one of the most famous plays ever written. That's Bijon Bhattacharya's politically influential play, Nabanno, which is an exemplary situation of this kind, was put on stage by Ipta. Now, the play had actually acquired an iconic status in popular protests, led by actors who were communists and reenacted with live improvisation during performances among the rural, and it deals with such a situation. The character in Nabanno, Pradhan Samudar, actually is an anxious protagonist, and he is also an example of this kind of a migrant who leaves home because he doesn't have enough rice. But in Samudar's soliloquy, which is a very important part of the text, one encounters a plethora of emotions, that it is not dictated by either legitimate claims to entitlement, that is more or less the area that Amartya Sen has dealt with in his work, or issues of morality, but he turns to question the meaning of vacuous human life itself. It's a soul-searching moment of critical humanism that leads to silent suffering, and that represented emotions not just to tide over the temporal phase of famine, but he also contemplates a routine bout of domestic trauma, such as accidental killings, murder, community infighting, hallucinations that pushed individuals to a point of exhaustion. And Samudar's anxiety exemplifies a range of famine victims' emotions that were disparate grievances, but could also add up to a personal vengeance or community clashes in contentious circumstances. Recently, Janam Mukherjee's work on famine actually stretches the famine structure in the period to include the Calcutta riots. And this kind of conforms partly to that kind of extending the temporal structure of famine to include this whole survival politics that revolves around the variety of emotions that we are talking. I also discuss briefly how rice therefore represents a survival strategy, and the importance of that kind of comes through in the migrant study of Bhavani Bhattacharya's He Who Rides a Tiger. And the importance of this particular text is that, how much time do I have I got? Oh, that's good. So I just wanted to go briefly into this kind of text, which I draw the difference between Carlo, who is the protagonist here. Is also a migrant. He's a blacksmith migrant who faces a range of obstacles, and he usually awaits the fate of a large number of landless and hungry rural population. But after foraging relentlessly for food and selling his tools, he joins the hungry masses in the city to fetch rice. The word fetch has a very important connotation here because it commences a new moral and political journey for Carlo. So Carlo in Tiger and Pradhan in Nabanno both are exemplary direct victims of famine who are observing in silence and passively the unfolding human tragedy in the city. But silence on their faces, but hiding the madness within, it culminates into a final act of self-criticism and political subversion. Carlo discusses the implications of the trade in women's bodies and his young cellmate wondering why a woman needed to die for the sake of honor. Carlo's interrogations are based on a real fear about his daughter Chandralekha, who is duped into migrating into the city by virtue of false information about his illness. And women like Lekha in the novel wind up in a brothel in order to procure food or save their relatives. And Bhattacharya to represent bodily annihilation leading to search of food in the city as a deep-seated conflict between matter and meaning, which structures the relationship between food and hungry bodies and morality and corruption in the narrative. So survival strategies were not only meant for physical safeguarding, but it also demonstrated moral compulsions. Women were illustrated as clinging onto the anchal of their sari, that is the bit of cloth that covers their breasts, to overcome shame or lodja in front of a male intruder, to collect some rice that is intimately precious to feed a dying child. And rice from her anchal, it symbolized the last resort of survival, exhausting the seed stock that we talked about earlier from the bhandar or the macha or the rooftop storage, and was kept for family subsistence. It is the last morsel of grain from the woman's anchal that became a last blow to her chastity as well. The grain was then designated as impure and filthy in content, like the woman's own soluble body in form. And queuing up for the gruel kitchen for some rice in the city's relief camp was viewed in similar immoral terms as it would be to stand in the queues for prostitution for the araddar or the city's rice contractors. In other words, it denoted as the intimate household commodity of subsistence becomes a remote commodity that had to be fetched through manipulations in different urban circumstances that are dissociated from its moral and emotional underpinnings. The tensions in the Langar Khana, which is also another area of the city which I also kind of highlight here, which is the site for urban food relief system. That is also a big area of contest in similar ways, how women actually queued up to secure rice from the Langar Khanas in the same way, and the way they were kind of dressed. Now, I don't want to sort of go into a very detailed description of Nabanno and Kalo, which I have done in my paper, but I also want to bring in the most important point here, that rice, which is the ultimate source of sustainability, was therefore encoded in the victims' consciousness of their desire to survive the famine in the same way they would actually value nourishment in times of prosperity. And this brings on the question of how is poverty then represented in popular culture, and what are the value of what actually is the value of showing poverty in this way in the whole realm of survival politics. So I want to move to the next slide, which shows the value of representation of poverty in popular culture and how it's a feature. I argue that this is important because it's actually a conventional site for interpreting famine conditions, and it's also a domain to search for famine causality and famine reasons. In the Chinese tradition, for example, we find that famine accounts exist where a causal distinction is shown between man-made floods and famine as exposures of heavenly wrath. Now, in the Bengal famine texts, while heavenly wrath loomed in the backdrop, the search for causality really led to exposing the multiple vectors of exploitation here, the corrupt practices of rice suppliers or failures of the British administration to stem the tide of hunger. So the period between 1940 and 1950, as you can see, is also there, is a crucial transformation in Bengal's politics and culture, with a distinct contribution of communist writers who were not necessarily influenced by the propaganda of their parties to actually draw a graphic testimony of the famine victims, and whose pictures are repeatedly used as a metaphor to evoke emotional responses in the campaigns. We do have just wanted to quickly show what the styles of the various artists are here. I mentioned Abedin, 1914 to 76. Chittaprasad is 15 to 78. And I've kind of, if you want to read through quickly what would be the styles and the purposes of this kind of art would then sort of be enacted. But I also want to, most importantly, look at the way that Chittaprasad actually goes out and, out of his normal routine life and moves with flattened rice and muri and goes about drawing these various sketches, recording life as it flowed without food in the kitchens and on the roads. And the same thing, I mean, these are the most sort of interesting parts of the story here. And it's also about the art material of the Famine artists that I've done. There's Somnath Hore here, whose collection is looked at the importance of lithographs that become metaphorically corresponding to the experience of attrition and existence. And the same that kind of looks at, again, the causes of famine in different examples of the works of the communist activist P.C. Joshi. But what is interesting here is that it will carry the tag of nostalgia for posterity, the famine artifacts, and they can be called to resemble a simplified version of what is popularization of history that captured the essences of the Bengal famine in terms of peasant victimhood of an inhuman trauma. And selective and sentimental appropriation of the famine can equally amount to what we can say a psychobabble, often glorifying the need to return to the realm of Sonar Bangla or the Golden Bengal. But the important thing here is that in the public realm, how is it that some of these artists who've worked on the various new art movement around this time, how is it actually transforming rice as a value-laden agricultural commodity, and it becomes a symbol of fair entitlement and exchange, relief, fair price, right to food, nutrition and health, and the legal structures of which were instrumental are used in the political campaign against hunger to reinstate the larger issues of right and justice. And there are various acts that come across here. By the 1940s, we find slide 20. I go into the left-wing discourses of popular politics that picks up around this time. I'm wrapping up now. By the 1940s, we find that wartime commodity controls accompanying rapid political change and opportunities for nefarious gains also conforms to the nexus that was evolving 2 decades earlier in the dramatic transformation of the cityscape and the way the spatial sense is affected by the flow of ideas, images, and publicity and campaign. So all this kind of comes together. Now, what I would quickly also say of can look at the famine images. Well, I can't get to this.
Just click it in.
Let's go to Akali Shantan in the film that I wanted to just finish by, I don't know where it's gone now.
Is it on the desktop?
Yeah, so how do I get out?
Where is it? This one?
Yeah, if we can play this, I think.
WMV is not a Mac format.
Okay, so we won't be able to play this. Can we stick to the images?
Okay, can I just quickly...
Sure.
Oh, is the images coming then?
If you click on the images on the right-hand side, we should be able to see them. If you see it's showing you the... Here you've got the images, so you should be able to see them at least small, or we can open them up in preview.
Oh no, that's gone into different.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Good weekend.
I'm sorry. It was a folder that you showed.
Maybe we can see this later, but I just want to draw the attention of what I draw from the political significance of these campaigns as well, that kind of shapes the right-based strategy around national food planning, and a program that was open to public consultations in the party's propaganda of the 1960s. And prior to that, we also get a whole range of price increase and resistance committees talking about corruption in a slightly different way. But similar to the post-colonial trends we look at, can be found in the way artistic enterprises mediated a social memory of Bengal famine by forcefully engaging with the symbolic value of rice in relation to more generic notions of poverty. And I think this is what Mrinal Sen's film tries to do, is he integrates these varied sensibilities of a memory of famine, and he searches for a woman's face to depict the disillusions representative of a famine victim. But in doing so, decades later, he ends up portraying similar malnourished bodies and faces as examples of poverty, and drawing from a relatively contemporary experience of village life. In Sen's film, a woman's struggle to keep her household running is also depicted by demonstrating the way rice symbolizes a special register of consumption, and the shortage of which was associated with the complexity of acquisition. And by mapping a continuum of rural poverty, Sen's post-colonial film actually draws out the political message of famine literature. And I want to finish by that, saying that the significance in the formation of public opinion on rural poverty in the decades after independence. Sen's inspiration from Akale Shandhane possibly derives from a moral compulsion a long-standing dilemma among the urban intelligentsia, who struggle in the film to comprehend and resolve rural poverty from a grassroots perspective of activism. The film relies on the plot of Famine, and it unravels the contribution of famine literature for shaping a post-colonial discourse on food sovereignty by highlighting the issue of survival. The impact of deprivation of rice manifests variously in the form of hunger, malnutrition, and rehabilitation, using the mandate from the existing politics of provision. Broadly speaking, these intersecting issues in the film are concerned with the materiality of rice and the ways in which this creates the discourses and impacts upon people's lives and society. At a symbolic and conceptual level, changing meanings of rice derived from famine art and literature feed into the process of delineating transformations in peasant power over struggles with food. And understanding these changes also contribute to mapping the differences between what I have tried to also show in the paper is an institutionalized process of agricultural development, which is where most of historical research has happened in mapping rural reconstruction projects, whether it's food aid or food campaigns or the right to food movement, and the policy formulation that goes with it. But the other is the fluid and the contested symbols of agrarian power relations. And I think that is what I wanted to bring it out. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Shanjukta, for a very detailed talk on what is effectively really a cultural history or cultural representations of famine and food politics in Bengal during that period. I do have a few questions of my own, but what I want to do is really just open, and I'll intersperse it with the questions from the audience. So what I want to do immediately is start opening the floor up to questions. If you have any, please do raise your hand, and there is no particular art to asking a question, so just ask it really. Yeah.
I don't know how informed this question is, but would you say that the British were greatly responsible for this famine?
I think so. I mean, the British, the role of British administration around this time is very well sort of documented. Madhushri Mukherjee's work shows the responsibilities of how food was distributed, how it was actually, not just within India, but how it was diverted, and all that. So it's the moral responsibility is a big sort of umbrella that you can look at. Is it all British, or is it also the way food controls and the neighboring areas of Bengal were also responding to that? Particularly, I know that in Bihar, for instance, when they had surplus grains to actually send it over to Bengal, there were such problems of sealing off the supply to a lot of Bengal villages, and also in East Bengal around that time, that there were unnecessarily price control measures and border control measures, and there's not a lot of information available as to how much was needed. So it's kind of well orchestrated in many ways. The media was very much involved in this. So it's a kind of a direct and an indirect thing. I don't like to sort of say entirely British, which is a predominant historiography here, that famine is kind of a construction of a whole range of the Second World War and the supply side of things and the price control side of things. But yes, I mean there is a large sort of role to look at here, and it's been researched quite a lot, how food grain prices were controlled, how it was distributed, how the information as to what is needed was there, and who actually was targeted. So it's a complex thing that you will have to touch on.
Would you say, sorry I'm going to bug you with this, but would you say it was a direct result as a failure of British policy, or would you say it was British policy to genuinely starve people?
I don't think it was a British policy, but that's not that we cannot historically substantiate that. Having studied the development of agricultural history for a while, if you look at how it's a conjunction of political factors here that we are looking at, really. The war is a big factor here, and you give me the money and I will probably look at Churchill's psychology to go and probably look further and delve deep into how rice imports were actually cut off, how Burmese rice was, for instance, viewed as an alternative, how food substitutes were kind of panned out. But what is also interesting to look at, and probably a direct answer to your question, is that where is nutrition policy in Second World War and in the food policy of the British around this time? It's largely absent. So that picks up after the war, when again this whole malnourishment and opushti, and rice is the biggest problem of relying too much on rice. That's all kind of picks up with the Right to Food campaign around this time. It's a very yield focused, very production orientated British policy that we have seen before 1943, that this is all to do with how Malthusian ideas of more and more people needs to be fed on yield-based strategy, and that did not work in the war period with the onset of famine. What is the reason for famine? Others have actually argued for natural causes for famine. Entitlement thesis can go, and so I actually think it's also that the whole natural calamity thing is regional. It's not something you can generalize in Bengal. It's very much restricted to the coastal areas, and there is no evidence that we can say that the entitlement theory doesn't work. It does work. So I am trying to look at the complex issues here.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Go on.
So, thank you for your talk. And you've probably been through every single film and poem and...
I don't know, there is a lot to look at. I have a few names.
As being absent from this archive.
Absent from the archive in terms of literature? What I haven't covered it all. There is quite a lot. You know, the photography is a big area, for instance. I haven't touched on...
anything that you think would be there?
During that time, the production period.
Say often you can understand an archive by the absence of...
Yes. I think one of the things that I'm struggling still is to look at the various enactments of Nabbanno, for instance, that went around in East Bengal as well. So I'm still sort of looking at those kind of reincarnations of Nabbanno. And what is interesting is that Abedin himself was very sold on Nabbanno at a later period. I have it in my article. I haven't actually gone in the paper, that it has different meanings. Nabbanno in Bijan Bhattacharya's play is really about how he returns to the village to a rice harvest ceremony. And the reincarnation of that in Abedin is how Nabbanno is actually at the background of an artist who is then experimenting with modern art. Modern art, again, moves slightly away from Famine towards 1952-55. You know, IPTA is having its own crisis. It's experimenting with theater rather than social reality. So all those factors are kind of taking art as a medium of engaging with social realism slightly away from how I have presented. And those are the gaps, you can say, in historical literature that one can look at. A lot of it is there in the south of India, for instance, you know, Kerala historical drama traditions that pick up on tribal and peasant politics is again tying up with IPTA's movement around this time. Coming back to Abedin, for instance, is a classic example of how the social memory of famine continues in the artist's consciousness, that he keeps Nabbanno in the background and he shows how he delves into modern art. So that picture of Nabbanno is actually then used to establish the Government College of Art in Bangladesh much later, at a much later period. So if you're looking at the gaps in literature, I would say, how intense was it around 50-59 when food campaign was very much high, and how it kind of fizzles out later. So those are the kind of gaps that one can look at. And of course there is an oral tradition that is another story here, that there is a lot of songs and village level performances which one has to probably see. But my point is, what are we actually gaining from more and more investigation into the cultural genre? Are we actually gaining more? I think we are, by questioning the changes in subaltern agency, because in famine history they are kind of portrayed in a certain way, that the peasant is weak, the peasant actually hasn't responded, the intelligentsia is removed from it. But the more we delve into this kind of survival politics in literature, we can actually get a different picture out. So that was the point that I was trying to make slightly.
Just sort of looking at the archives here, the archives here, quite a long time, sort of a combination of Malthusian notions combined with Smith's idea of a reasonably well-working invisible hand of the market is the kind of prevalent thesis thrown here and there in literature to explain the market defect theory, as it were, that somehow folks were experimenting with this dual ideology in the market, which turned out to be a very crude experiment. Right?
What do you mean by experiment with market? But around this time, you mean?
The invisible hand of the market, underpinning notion is that the invisible hand of the market works reasonably well, right? And the Malthusian idea is that if there is shortage, people will die, right? So if you combine the two, you have a notion that that is of a recently produced, perhaps not rigorously tested, twin ideas, which are then somehow turned into non-intervention in a state of crisis, and it is, and then obviously the usual defense is that only 10% of the market rice was exported to the war requirement, so to speak. So
10%.
So
Did you get this from Amartya Sen's work, or?
I think I got it from some of the administrators' diaries.
Okay.
So the actual amount is very limited. But you pointed out very kindly the other ideas of not bringing food from elsewhere.
Yes.
So maybe the market became perverted in a way, and the view was that you did being underpinned by those twin ideologies. There was maybe laziness or poor administration or reluctance to intervene. What I'm interested in asking is that to what extent the literature at the time here in England, the sort of the intellectual speak and the debate about the usage of these twin ideas to somehow explain away the famine. How does it appear here among in the House of Lords, in the Commons, in the discourse between intellectuals here?
That's a very interesting question. This is mainly kind of revolves around how the war has an impact in the parliamentary debates, and in many ways it tries to kind of justify that the army has to be fed and so on. And Britain itself is very caught up around this time to feed its own people and look after the nutrition of those people. So there's a lot of, but the non-government response in Britain around this time is a very key area to look at, and I don't think there is a lot of research on that still to actually see. The statesman plays a very crucial role here. I think Ian Stephens has done a brilliant job, and there's a lot of coverage in parliamentary debates around how it was circulated. But he himself defied a lot of the orders that were being passed from here. The overwhelming thrust was just sabotage the information and give it a picture of bounty and plentifulness rather than talk of shortage. So that's there in the parliamentary discourse. The predominant idea is that there is no famine. There's a lot of problem with just identifying Bengal famine as a famine. There's a problem with local terminology that is being used. There is a difference in the way famine was actually described in terms of shortage of food or in terms of deaths of people or the number of deaths. So it's kind of a very layered discourse in Britain around this time as well. That is it about shortage of food? Is it about the number of people dying, or is it about something that is a moral responsibility of Bengal to feed the British Army, for that matter? So that this is quite a complex area, and it's a very interesting question as well to promote this. So yeah, thank you for that.
I think so.
A certain amount of wheat was also exported from Punjab, and I haven't seen any literature on comparing the export models and its implications for wheat export versus rice export. Have you seen anything?
What, from Punjab, you mean?
I'm comparing the two models.
Okay.
One did not have that effect.
Okay.
One did, yeah.
Yes, it's very interesting to bring out this comparison that, would the Bengal famine have happened in Punjab? Would it? Question, I don't know. Okay, but the question is that the production of wheat around the canal irrigation colonies of Punjab and the rhetoric of its plentifulness and the fact that it can actually feed lots of people is tied to the idea that yield actually works with large holding land owners of the northwest and the north of India, but with the small holding Bengali peasant, where the relations of subsistence are already breaking down over the zamindari crisis and the responsibility of zamindars, then would they actually even eat wheat? Because they won't. Chapati probably has a different concept in a community where rice has, then again to pit between rice and its alternatives, you will find that there is no alternative. You can't say that in Sri Lanka, which is also a very rice eating society. It kind of has managed drought situations and failure of food in those areas with other alternatives like even vegetables or fruits or other kinds, and that is kind of silenced as a measure, as a method of resilience in famine areas of Bengal, where the peasant actually will not even touch what is their indigenous vegetables, like kochu, for instance, which is a root vegetable, easily available. There's other green leafy vegetables around the pond, which is easily available, and that kind of diet is pitted against rice. What is nourishing, what is nice, what is white rice. Even brown rice from Burma was not good enough. So so it's the dynamics of actually importing food into Bengal was very much tied to the way it's culturally perceived as well. So, the whole wheat question is quite can add to a good comparison in many ways. Yeah.
I never thought about white rice supremacy. I think a lot about white supremacy.
Yes, white rice is I'll give you an example that when the mills come about in the villages, I've actually got a para on this which I didn't read out, is how dheki rice, which is the rice hulling machine in the village, was the unpolished red coarse grain that is consumed by a certain section of the population, and the demarcation between white rice, that is polished mill rice, again creates a sense of status and a sense of distinction that they will eat, they have to eat. But even among the laborers, you're finding that consciousness is sort of stepping in. Yeah, but what you actually don't know is that during the actual distribution of rice in Calcutta, the urban laborers working in the industrial districts were actually refusing to have red rice even from the Burmese exports. They insisted on having the polished rice mill. By that time, the consumer choice is actually becoming far more complex than one would actually want to believe that happened even 10 years ago.
When you're talking about fen, I'm thinking about, I generate lots of the stuff, I wash it out, and people used to want that. I don't know, starch is still nutrition, but it made me also think of, pathetic development programs. And if you think of fen, it's just the offcuts, it's like
it's just like a leftover.
Micro credit, micro, it's really interesting patheticness. Have you seen that developed in plays or theatre?
Yes, it has, because fan is being distributed next to a dog in a dustbin. The rice is being collected from the dustbin, and then the fan is let out in the langar khana as the inferior food. And then there is a whole medical discourse around what actually fan does to the skeleton, to the frame of the famine victim. So there's a lot of medical literature on the impact of fan on diarrhea and other diseases that the famine victims actually go through. So there's a kind of...
The middle class would make them worse.
Make them worse?
The fan,
Yeah, the fan is just is like a disposable gruel, which is all they were wanting because they knew they weren't going to get the rice. So it's interesting how the famine victim is just wanting that, the leftover of your own share, and that is not something that they would be doing in a traditional subsistence situation or a relationship where the expectation is to share rice, not to share the leftover. But in the city, it is the leftover that you are sharing, if at all.
You mentioned that, sorry to continue, continuing trope of the pessimistic, fatalistic peasant. Of course, hungry, malnutrition people can't go to war against the system, can they?
But there are instances. No, yeah. But I'm mentioning about the literature that is sort of like a constant factor here, where the famine response is looked at as a fatalistic response of the Bengali peasant, something which Sugata Bose has obviously mentioned and others. But my point is that if you look at the way the whole cultural response then kind of pans out, you will find that the agency, the subaltern agency, is actually quite empowering, and it has an empowering effect, and it changes from the way, say, Mahashita Devi has looked at the whole famine situation, and the way women characters have come out of it, and the way authority is also perceived, and the various categories of authorities that emerge around this time. Like I've given an example of the Aradar, the contractor, the food relief centers, and you will find that the politics of food campaign picks up on these images and these texts, which is again addressing the silencing of your topic, that you haven't looked at the posters and the political literature and pamphlets that are in circulation around this time that makes these kind of connections and talks of how the peasant can be a stronger figure in politics. Around this time, till 1959, I would say the food campaign was very strong. It's particularly not just the Communist Party's demonstrations, but even outside it. I think that's where the research has to be, where the non-government organizations pick up around this time, whereas women's organization, for instance, also comes about.
We have a question there.
I'm so sorry to have been late, unavoidably delayed, and because it's such a very, very important topic. I'd like to, if I may, make one point and ask one question. Now, on the subject of white rice, from what I've read, from the point of view of nutrition and balancing the doshas, the brown rice is far more sattvic. That you're basically taking all the goodness and you're just unbalancing things by having white rice. So that, as I understand matters, it's very important if one wants to avoid or minimize the effects of diabetes to have the brown rice. And also there's scientific research showing that half a teaspoon of cinnamon powder, ordinary common cinnamon powder, is statistically significant in clinical trials, the way it balances the diabetes. Now my question, if I may, it's about the great Rabindranath Tagore. So I'm researching his work for a book. And forgive me if it's been covered already, but as I understand matters, he was an extraordinarily enlightened zamindari for his time, and created effectively a state within a state, and also had his son Raki educated in America in agricultural science. So he's very much looking what are the best crops for the locality, so that our people can be fed and good nutrition, etc. I just don't know if in the light of the famine, there's any comment you could make about, my understanding is he was seeking in the Tagore states to create like a model of a village system.
Yes.
So very much the judiciary, local police force, schools, the people had some sort of a council, as I understand, that they decided on some sort of I want to call it a tax to administer things like schools and roads, and his microcredit bank, which was the inspiration from one of the Unisys Bank. And I just, in the context of his work striving to create a model village system that India could emulate. And it's extraordinary. I feel he deserves the Nobel Prize in Peace for creating, at a time of incredible oppression by the British, creating what was effectively a state within a state, and having such a relationship with the British that it worked so efficiently, the British just decided they're not going to sabotage, they're going to let it run, because it saved them the cost of the magistrates' courts, etc., that everything's working really well. So just in the context of the famine, I'd be so grateful for any comments you could make about Tagore's work.
There is, Tagore obviously is not alive around the time Bengal famine happens.
No,
but it's before that you're interested. There's a very interesting thing that is happening in Birbhum itself with rice experiments, for instance, and the rice industry is actually quite sort of strong in many ways. The rice milling technology was picking up in the Birbhum area, in the lower Birbhum area, and it was there that very important village surveys were being undertaken just prior to famine. One very important person was Hashim Amirali. I have a reference here. I can add more later if you like. And Hashim Amirali was an indigenous surveyor who went around the village and looked at the declining of rice yield around this time. And he, very interestingly, could see that there is a big gap between what the peasant would like to produce and bring up the yield of that rice and how the new seed and the new technology was being promoted. There's a wide gap between the cropping decision of the rice cultivator and the British idea of actually improving the rice production. And the reasons are very interesting from his survey, because the idea of a drought-resistant rice seed among the peasants is very much rooted in certain ways of actually cultivating rice tied to seasonal drought conditions and things like that. So they will not necessarily buy into the logic of a high-yield seed for growing rice. Now, whether that works or not, we don't know. But in the around that time, 1941-42, Hashim Amirali was right in the forefront, trying to say that look, rice cultivation was actually declining in many ways around Birbhum and that area, and it had all to do with how dry weather conditions were able to cope with pressures as well. But in Birbhum itself, there is a big dislocation between the laborers who were engaged with rice mills. Rice mill comes into Birbhum at a very early stage in the model village of Tagore, and it dislocates labor around that time as well. And the distinction I'm trying to bring in between Dheki rice and rice mills very much applies to Tagore's experiments around that time. Sriniketan is very much affected by that. So, the larger question is whether Tagore preempted something like this. He has been, probably because he has talked of agricultural improvement in different ways, and one of his ways was to engage with the peasant more than look at policies from the top. So that's been the running theme in Sriniketan quite a long time. And there's another thing I wanted to mention is that the fear of rice scarcity is not something that happens just around famine. It happens long before that. And that is something that needs more research, I think, to look at how farm experiments, farm responses to high yield technology, and all these things just after the Depression, and in the last say towards the early 1940s were actually becoming quite strong, that the Bengalis we're actually talking of, annapa, that is the scarcity of rice. And it's not just economics here, but it's also kind of culturally affecting the village. So that is there.
If we could save our questions for refreshments, I think we do have to go on to the next talk, and perhaps we should take a 10 minutes break. But before doing that, I'd like to thank Shanjukta for giving a wonderful talk.